Ancient Greek times look amazing in movies and history books, but the reality was more like death wrapped in marble and myths. You've probably watched the movie 300 and thought those abs looked pretty cool, or maybe you dreamed about hanging out with Socrates, talking about deep stuff while eating grapes. Well, snap back to reality because ancient Greece would destroy you faster than you can say, "This is Sparta." The place that gave us democracy and philosophy was also a nightmare factory with about 1,000 different ways to die horribly. Most of those ways would make medieval torture look like a playground game. Let me break down exactly why you wouldn't last one day in ancient Greece. You wake up in ancient Athens around 450 BC, dust yourself off, and immediately realize you're completely screwed. That Greek alphabet you half remember from college? Totally useless. Ancient Greek sounds nothing like modern Greek. It's like trying to understand Shakespeare if he was drunk, talking through a mouth full of olives, and using completely different grammar rules. The locals would look at your attempts to communicate like you're having some kind of breakdown, and in a society where being different meant being dangerous, that's really bad news for you. You'd be trying to ask for directions using wild hand gestures that probably look like you're either losing your mind or casting some weird magic spell. But let's say you somehow manage to make yourself understood through crazy charades. Congratulations, you just became the most suspicious person in town. Ancient Greeks were super paranoid about foreign spies, weird religious stuff, and basically anyone who didn't fit in perfectly. Your strange clothes, your weird accent, and your complete inability to understand basic social rules would mark you as either a barbarian, a spy, or someone touched by the gods. None of those labels end well for you. The first thing you'd notice about ancient Greek cities is the smell. And brother, it would drop you flat on your modern behind. Imagine a mixture of human waste, rotting fish, burning olive oil, unwashed bodies, leather chemicals, and animal sacrifices all mixed together in a soup of stench that would make a garbage truck driver cry. There was no garbage collection, no real sewage system, and definitely no concept of personal hygiene like we know it. People threw their waste directly into the streets. The lucky ones lived near rivers where the smell could at least move downstream to become someone else's problem. Your modern nose, used to air fresheners and deodorant, would be under constant attack. The Greeks did use perfumes and oils, but these were expensive luxuries most people couldn't afford. The average person smelled like they'd been marinating in their own sweat for months, because they basically had been. Baths were rare, usually saved for special occasions or religious ceremonies. The idea of daily washing was considered both wasteful and potentially dangerous to your health. Yeah, they thought staying dirty was healthier than being clean. Speaking of health, let's talk about the medical care you'd get in ancient Greece. It makes medieval medicine look like a top hospital. Yes, Hippocrates was making some progress with his unconventional idea that diseases might not always be caused by angry gods, but good luck finding someone who actually knew what they were doing. Most doctors were just random people who claimed they could heal you. No training, no licensing, and definitely no malpractice insurance. Got a headache? Time for some bloodletting, because obviously you have too much blood in your body. Feeling sick to your stomach? Let's drill a hole in your skull to let the bad spirits out. This procedure was called trepanation, and it was about as successful as it sounds. Broken bone? Well, they might try to set it, but without painkillers, antiseptics, or proper surgical tools, you'd be begging for death long before the healing began. The survival rate for any serious medical procedure was basically like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets loaded. The Greeks believed in 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought illness came from these being out of balance. This led to treatments that included making you throw up until you passed out, forcing you to drink various toxic mixtures, and yes, more bloodletting. If you were really unlucky, they might decide your illness was caused by supernatural forces and recommend you spend the night in a temple hoping for divine help. Temple medicine basically meant sleeping in a sacred place and hoping you'd have a dream that would cure you. That's about as effective as it sounds. But let's say you somehow avoid getting sick and survive the sensory assault of ancient Greek cities. Now you've got to figure out how to eat, and buddy, you're in for a world of disappointment. Forget everything you think you know about Mediterranean food from your local Greek restaurant. The average person's diet was about as exciting as cardboard soup, and probably less nutritious. Most people lived on something called cetos, which was basically just barley porridge. Day after day, meal after meal, the same bland, watery mush that would make prison food seem fancy. If you were lucky, you might get some beans or lentils mixed in, but fresh vegetables were seasonal luxuries most people rarely saw. Meat was so expensive, it was basically reserved for religious festivals and rich people's tables. The average person might taste meat a few times a year, and when they did, it was usually questionable parts of an animal that had been sacrificed to the gods. Fish were more common if you lived near the coast, but inland people were out of luck. And when fish was available, it was often preserved in salt until it was basically leather with fins. Fresh fish spoiled quickly in the Mediterranean heat, so most of what people ate had been sitting around for days or weeks, developing a smell and taste that would send you running back to McDonald's. The bread, when you could get it, was made from barley or wheat that was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Imagine eating bread that might give you a bad trip or kill you. That was just Tuesday, in ancient Greece. Now let's talk about where you'd be sleeping, assuming you live long enough to need rest. Privacy was a concept that didn't exist for about 90% of the population. Most families lived in single-room houses where everyone slept together on the floor or on simple raised platforms. You'd be sharing your sleeping space with multiple family members, any guests who happened to be passing through, and probably a selection of bugs and rodents that considered your home their home too. The floors were typically just packed dirt. The walls were thin mud brick that provided little protection from weather. And the roof was made of tiles that leaked when it rained. In winter, your only heat source was a small fire pit in the center of the room, which filled the house with smoke since chimneys weren't really a thing yet. You'd basically be choosing between freezing to death or slowly choking on smoke. And either way, you wouldn't be getting much sleep. Beds, when they existed, were basically wooden frames with rope or leather straps stretched across them, topped with whatever fabric or animal skins you could afford. No mattresses, no pillows as we know them, just hard surfaces that would leave you aching and miserable. But let's say you somehow adapt to the living conditions and find food that doesn't kill you. Now you've got to worry about the legal system, which was basically designed to screw over anyone who wasn't born into wealth and power. Justice in ancient Greece was less about right and wrong and more about who had more money and better connections. If someone accused you of a crime, any crime, you were basically guilty until proven innocent. And proving innocence often involved surviving various forms of torture or ordeal. Think someone stole your sandals? Just accuse a random foreigner like yourself. The burden of proof was on you to prove you didn't do it, and the methods for proving innocence were often more dangerous than the punishment for the crime itself. Trial by ordeal was popular. They might make you stick your hand in boiling water, and if the burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they got infected, which they almost always did without modern medicine, you were guilty and would be executed. Or they might tie you up and throw you in a river. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. If you floated, you were obviously guilty of witchcraft or whatever they were accusing you of, and they'd execute you anyway. The death penalty was handed out for crimes that today might get you a small fine. Stealing food because you were starving? Death. Cutting down the wrong tree? Death. Insulting someone with political connections? Believe it or not, death. And if you think you could just keep your head down and avoid trouble, think again. Ancient Greek society was incredibly divided by class, and if you weren't born into the right family, you were basically screwed from day one. About 30% of the population were slaves with absolutely no rights. Another 40% were foreign residents who couldn't own property or participate in government. Most of the remaining 30% were poor citizens, whose main privilege was dying in wars they didn't start. Social mobility was basically non existent. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born a slave, you died a slave unless you got incredibly lucky. The idea that hard work and determination could improve your life was laughable. Your social position was determined by birth, and that was that. Now let's talk about work, because you'd need to find some way to survive economically, and your options would be both limited and terrible. Most jobs involved backbreaking physical labor from sunrise to sunset, 6 or 7 days a week, for wages that barely covered basic survival. Farming was the most common job, but it meant working in the blazing Mediterranean sun with primitive tools, constantly worried about droughts, floods, bugs, and raiders who might destroy your crops just for fun. If you weren't cut out for farming, you might try a trade, but becoming a skilled craftsman required years of unpaid training starting in childhood. Even if you somehow managed to learn a trade as an adult, you'd be competing with people who had been doing the work since they were 7 years old. Manual labor was always available, but it paid almost nothing and was incredibly dangerous. Construction work meant hauling massive stone blocks without modern equipment, risking serious injury or death every day. Mining was even worse. Workers typically died within a few years from cave-ins, toxic fumes, or lung diseases. Even if you found work, getting paid was another challenge entirely. There was no standardized money in many places, no labor laws, no workplace safety rules, and certainly no workers' compensation if you got hurt on the job. Employers could decide not to pay you on a whim, and there was basically nothing you could do about it. But perhaps the biggest threat to your survival would be the constant warfare that plagued ancient Greece. City-states were constantly fighting each other over territory, trade routes, resources, or just because they were bored and felt like having a war. The concept of professional armies was still developing, which meant regular citizens, including you, would be forced to fight, whether you wanted to or not. Military service wasn't optional, and there were no conscientious objector exemptions or alternative service options. When your city-state decided to go to war, you went to war, end of story. And you were expected to provide your own weapons and armor, which meant poor people went into battle with basically no protection while the wealthy showed up looking like knights. The fighting itself was absolutely brutal. Battles were fought hand-to-hand with swords, spears, and shields, meaning you'd literally be trying to stab people to death while they tried to do the same to you. There were no rules of war, no medical corps to patch you up if you got wounded. You fought until you won, died, or were taken as a slave. Those were your only options. Even if you somehow survived a battle, the aftermath could be even worse. Wounded soldiers were often left to die on the battlefield because medical care was practically non-existent. Let's not forget about slavery, which was so common in ancient Greece that even middle-class families typically owned at least one or two human beings. As a confused foreigner with no local connections, you'd be prime slavery material. Getting kidnapped and sold was a constant threat, especially if you couldn't prove you were a free citizen, which would be impossible since you'd have no documentation, no family to vouch for you, and no legal standing in society. Slavery in ancient Greece wasn't like the sanitized version you might see in movies. It was brutal, dehumanizing, and often deadly. Slaves were considered property, not people, and could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their owner's whim. By now, you're probably thinking you could avoid all these problems by living as a hermit somewhere in the countryside. Bad news, that wasn't really an option either. Ancient Greece was full of bandits, raiders, and wild animals that would make your solitary life very short and very unpleasant. Wolves, bears, and wild boars roamed the forests and mountains, and they weren't the cute, manageable animals you see in nature documentaries. These were hungry predators that saw humans as just another meal option. Without modern weapons or safety equipment, encountering any of these animals would likely be your last encounter with anything. Human predators were even worse. Bandits operated throughout the countryside, robbing and killing travelers without consequence. Pirates controlled many of the sea routes, capturing anyone unlucky enough to cross their path and selling them into slavery. And let's not forget about the weather, which could be just as deadly as any human enemy. Mediterranean summers were scorching hot, and without air conditioning, proper shelter, or adequate water supplies, heat stroke was a constant threat. Winters could be surprisingly cold and wet, and without proper heating or waterproof clothing, hypothermia and pneumonia were major killers. Natural disasters were another constant threat that ancient Greeks had no way to predict or prepare for. Earthquakes were common throughout the region, and without modern building codes, most structures would collapse at the first serious tremor. The psychological stress of living in ancient Greece would probably break you long before any physical threats got the chance. Imagine living every day knowing that a single accusation could get you executed, that any injury could kill you, that your next meal might be your last, and that there's absolutely nothing you can do to improve your situation. The constant fear, uncertainty, and hopelessness would drive most modern people to complete mental breakdown. There were no therapists, no medications for depression, no support groups or ways to deal with trauma and stress. People who couldn't handle the pressure were considered weak or cursed by the gods, making their situation even worse. Suicide was sometimes seen as an honorable way out, but even that wasn't always an option depending on your religious beliefs and social position. The simple truth is that ancient Greece, for all its cultural and intellectual achievements, was a brutal, dangerous place where life was cheap and death was always just around the corner. The democracy, philosophy, and art that we admire today were created by and for a tiny elite who lived on the backs of slaves and poor citizens who had no voice, no rights, and no hope of a better life. Your modern expectations of fairness and human rights, your reliance on technology and modern conveniences, would make you completely unsuited for survival in this harsh ancient world. You'd probably last about as long as an ice cube in hell, and your death would be just another anonymous tragedy in a world where anonymous tragedies happened every single day. The people who survived in ancient Greece were born into it. They grew up with the smells, the violence, the uncertainty, and the constant threat of death. They didn't know any different. But you're used to antibiotics when you get sick, police when someone threatens you, and grocery stores when you're hungry. You expect clean water when you turn on a tap, a warm bed when you're tired, and laws that actually protect you. None of that existed in ancient Greece. You'd be completely out of your element, like a fish trying to survive in the desert. So the next time you're feeling nostalgic for the good old days, or thinking that ancient civilizations had it all figured out, remember that you're looking at history through rose-colored glasses. The reality is that you wouldn't last 24 hours in ancient Greece, and you should be grateful every single day that you live in an era with modern medicine, human rights, and indoor plumbing. Because trust me, the past was not a place you want to visit, let alone live in. Those ancient Greeks who created all the philosophy and art we admire, they were the lucky few who had enough money and power to think about higher things, while everyone else was just trying to survive another day.